Okay, nice to have you in Chile,
Thank you,
Keith. So it's great that you got the courage
Yeah,
to come and know it.
really my
a
pleasure.
long trip, and you've been very doing many things during this day. So appreciate your
very
effort,
enjoyable.
and I hope it's been rewarding for you.
It really has. Yeah, it's been a fantastic trip.
All right, so I'd like to ask you a few questions that could help people in Chile understand your field of work and as well as the field of social networks in general. I wonder if you could speak a little about your trajectory. I mean, what draws you to the field of communication and social networks? What kind of research have you done? What kind of methodology? That type of things.
Sure. So, first and foremost, I'm a sociologist, but I never wanted to be a sociologist. I wanted to be an architect.
Is that true?
It's true. But what I really wanted to do is I wanted to understand how people interacted with their environment, with the idea that maybe you could build better environments that would make people happier or more supported. And when I talked to architects about this, they laughed. They were like, wow, that's so funny. We never really want to do that. You know, planners and architects, we don't really care about, the people in the space. We care about art. And I'm a terrible artist, so I was never going to fit in that community. So I wanted to try and find ways to understand how we build community and shape communities and how that might then affect people's relationships.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so what was your first research?
So my first research, I did my PhD at the University of Toronto with a sociologist there named Barry Wellman, who was also your dissertation
That's right.
advisor.
So
Yeah.
say hi to Barry Wellman.
So say hi to Barry, yes. And the reason I wanted to work there is because Barry is one of the first and foremost scholars in the area of social network analysis.
But at that time, I guess he had a name also in urban studies.
Yeah.
He was studying urban communities and done a lot of work on that and classic work on the community question, on this argument about lost, safe, and liberated community.
That's exactly it. So to me, the study of social networks is the study of communities. And I inherited that from Barry, who made this argument that, historically, over time, community has changed in different ways. And we have this perception that community is kind of inherently lost, that sometime in the distant past, relationships were just, so much better, right? We had more intimacy and we were closer to our families and our friends, and we, local neighborhoods and communities must have just been better somehow.
That's right.
And that really doesn't hold up very well when we look at, where people actually get their social support. So yes, communities changed. Absolutely, right? But now we get it, in different ways, but we're still getting social support. We still are happy. We have, contact with friends and family in different ways. And that means that we start to look at community differently. Rather than just looking at place, we start to look at our social networks.
That's right. So he was a revolutionary in that sense. But he was looking actually to things like the phone that has spread at the time, and people were speaking over long distances, and the use of the car and highways and the opportunities it offered to go beyond your neighborhood. But when you started your PhD, I understand he was making a transition from that type of technologies to the digitally supported communication. So especially the impact of the internet at that time and later of the cell phones and that type of things, and you engaged in a very interesting study, which could be very interesting because it's a well-known concept that Barry and you introduced, that it makes no sense to divide online and offline social relationships. They make all part of the same. So I'd like you to speak about that study.
Yeah, so this was at a time, it was the late to mid 1990s, and in Canada at the time where we were, internet access in the home was reaching a point where people were increasingly likely to have some sort of internet access. Usually it was dial-up internet access. There was no such thing as broadband at the time. And there was a lot of hype in the media about how having access to the internet in your home would affect your community and affect your relationships. And there was this idea of kind of two different visions. One was somehow people are just going to be sitting alone in their bedrooms, on their computers, by themselves, their families in different parts of the house, and they won't be interacting. And what would they be doing online? Well, it's the internet. It's about global. So people would somehow be connecting with people on the other side of the planet in very specialized interest groups, and there was
wouldn't look in the eye.
You wouldn't be, you wouldn't have this going on anymore. Instead, you'd be like this, and you'd be connected to people, far, far away. And in exchange, you would lose your local connections. So we were really interested in trying to understand, how much truth is there to this?
That's right. And you did an ethnography.
Yeah, so we found this neighborhood that was being built in suburban Toronto at the time. And we gave it a pseudonym, a fake name to protect the identity.
Okay. Well, all right.
It was to protect the innocent, because at the time there was this hype that people who moved there would be socially isolated and their community would fall apart, and this neighborhood would never be a neighborhood because everybody would be given broadband internet access there. And when they were given this broadband access in Netville, that the community would fall apart. So we adopted the pseudonym really to protect them from what we might find, right? So I moved there in this neighborhood and lived in a basement apartment for 2 years. And the community was special because it was probably the first neighborhood in Canada, for sure, maybe one of the first in the United States or in America in general, where everybody had high-speed broadband fiber optic connections to their house. They gave them very fast internet access. It gave them, a lot of the technologies that we have today, like access to healthcare professionals over broadband, music, all sorts of games and resources. And by moving there, I wanted to learn about how people's everyday lives would change as a result of having all this stuff in their house, right? And then we interviewed people before they moved in, and then as they were moving in over the years. And we found some really interesting things. I mean, that counter to this expectation that community would fall apart, that people would lose contact with neighbors and with their families. We found the exact opposite. Mm-hmm. We found that those people with those broadband connections, they recognized more of their neighbors in person. They called them on the phone more often. They talked to each other more in person. They were more successful in organizing to deal with local problems that they were having. And we called it globalization. So instead of globalization, the idea that somehow you would be connected at a distance, we were finding distant contact, but also very, very local contact.
So you created the word global?
Globalization. Yeah. Well, we independently created it. Others were, it turns out, also using it at around the same time to refer to similar types of ideas.
Oh, right. Yeah. Okay. So now these affordances of the new technologies, you argue that are changing the shape of the community. Not it's only the people interacting more, but they are interacting in a more, you say, persistent form, and that community is pervasive right now. I don't know if you can elaborate on those ideas.
Absolutely. So Barry and in the 1990s, early 2000s, the concerns about how internet was affecting relationships were this dystopian image, but at the same time, people recognized that the internet was breaking down the cost of distance, that it was easier to reach people further away. It reduced the amount of time required. It reduced the amount of effort to travel that physical distance, just like with the automobile and the telephone. And when you think about how that might affect people's relationships, truly it's just a continuation of that existing model of what we had with the telephone and trains and even things like the telegraph. It just made it easier to reach people at a distance. And we felt it also increased contact locally. But there's something, I think, about newer internet technologies, not 1990s anymore, but things that are happening today around social media and mobile phones that are truly changing the structure of those interactions.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, Facebook, things like text messaging on your mobile phone, there's always that, that news feed of little bits of information that are coming at you. And one question that people ask is does that little bit of information add up to anything?
That's right.
You get it constantly.
We are used to read books, so
that
doesn't make any sense.
It's a couple hundred characters. It's a picture of someone's lunch. What does that mean? Does it mean anything at all? And I was interested in knowing, does that kind of ongoing, pervasive awareness of everyday activities and the lives of people around you matter? And this distinction between those people who are online sending this information to you and your offline friends and family just doesn't hold up. And Barry and I long ago recognized that really those people who are online connected to you, those people who are texting you, your friends on Facebook, these are your real friends. They're not your virtual friends. They're not like a separate world out there.
Mm-hmm.
These are the same people you see in person and you talk to on the phone. And now that you're getting all these little bits of information from them in your newsfeed and on your text message, does it change things like your opinions? Does it make you more aware of important things happening in their lives?
Mm-hmm.
Does it allow you to give them more social support? Or does it really just suck up all your time? Right? And the other thing that's kind of interesting here is it's not just the little bits of information coming from them, but things like Facebook and the fact that your cell phone number never changes, right? I mean, your kids, how long have they had their same cell phone number? Probably quite a while.
Yeah, their whole life.
Their whole life, right? No longer do friends lose contact because you lose a phone number due to mobility. You change houses or neighborhoods or change jobs. And the same with Facebook, right? Your primary school friends, they're with you forever, right? And you can't get rid of them. And it's the same when you change one job and move to another job, those relationships stick with you.
Right, that could be a blessing, but
it could be.
That's also some downside.
Yes. Yeah, so these relationships are now much more persistent than they were in the past. So one of the things that we used to believe about this community lost idea was that people were moving so much and had so much mobility that they weren't attached to people in the way that they were before. But now, thanks to social media, you're attached to those people in an enduring way that we haven't seen for many generations. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot changing about our community structure.
Okay, so you speak of Facebook, but is the same thing happening in other platforms?
Oh, absolutely. This isn't about Facebook. The reason I tend to talk about Facebook a lot is that in the US where I am now, it's the dominant social media. If you're using social media, you're using Facebook. But there are other social media out there that give similar opportunities for interaction. Certainly mobile phones through text messaging, other kind of applications that allow you to articulate a relationship with somebody who is from the real world, an existing friend, and communicate with them over time through sharing little bits of information.
So, are there any variations in the use of these technologies, for instance, for age, sex, or
absolutely
origin? I don't know.
Yeah, so this is where it gets really complicated. We have this belief that we should, call it social media and put it all in one great big bucket, and then it must act on people in similar ways. But that's really not how it works. Men and women, we choose different technologies for different purposes. And it turns out when we looked at technologies like LinkedIn, this platform that connects professionals, we find that men are much more likely to use LinkedIn. But when we look at other social media like Pinterest, for example, women are much more likely to use that. And men and women's choice and people of different ages' choice to use different technology is going to impact what effect those technologies have on people.
Yeah. Okay, so you say then that our contacts are following us the whole life and we can keep them in a sort of dense social network. Isn't that a little close to the idea of the safe community? Isn't that close to the idea of a traditional community where everybody knows with each other, they can monitor their behaviors, and it's hard to be unnoticed by other people.
I think you're right. So, I mean, the traditional community, the way we kind of idealize it, is one where we have relatively small social networks that are densely connected. Everybody knows everyone else, and everyone knows what everybody else is doing, and there's this kind of informal watchfulness of, what, Jenny is doing at home alone with some boy, and everybody knows that she's there. Everybody knows when you leave for work. Everybody knows what type of work you do. Everybody knows something about your past. It's not so different as a result of a lot of these new technologies. It turns out those little tiny bits of information are really good at communicating things that we might have assumed we've known, or things that we never would have had time or thought to ask. Little bits of information about your preferences, your opinions, where you've been, what your political ideology is, and it starts to sneak in little tiny bites.
I see. However, in communication there is an effect of redundancy that tends to flatten the diversity. I mean, different opinions, as long as you're repeating those, they tend to equate and makes social networks more homogeneous in terms of in terms of their opinion, their behaviors, their tastes. I mean, they listen to the same music, they comment about the same movies or series or whatever. I mean, so in that sense, isn't that threatening diversity?
Yeah, so here's the interesting thing. I mean, a lot of what we assume we know about people is based not on conversation, but what we would call homophily, this tendency for us to choose friends who are a lot like us in many, many different ways. We like similar music, we went to some of the same schools or some of the same community, and those little bits of information that we are finding on Facebook about, or other social media, about our friends and family are often unspoken things that we assumed we had in common, but now are being revealed and look like diversity. So when we find, for example, that people who use these social media tend to have more diverse social networks, it could be that they're meeting more people and making it more diverse. Or more likely, I think, we're just finding out more about the differences that exist amongst our existing friend and family. That there's much more diversity amongst us than we realize. And awareness of that diversity can be really challenging.
Okay, so that's the idea of awareness that we were taking for granted. That people who share some taste with us would have the same viewpoints,
same political
opinions, and so on and so forth. And well, in the field of political opinions, you found very strong differences within the networks because people tends to avoid political discussions.
Yeah, so we're finding that people who use these social media, when we ask them about the opinions that their friends and family have about different political issues, that the more social media that they use, the more certain they are about their friends and family's opinions. And some of that certainty, is them being reassured that their friends and family have the same beliefs, but there's also a lot of discovery of difference. And when they're aware of that difference, it's starting to create new dynamics that I don't think we completely understand yet. Because, when you find out that close friends have very strong political opinions that are the opposite of yours, it introduces a new dynamic. And you have to decide, well, do I really like this friend? Do I want to maintain this relationship? And if it's a close friend, you probably do. So you have to start to learn on how to deal with difference. And sometimes that results in a kind of fear of talking about politics. And we have found that people, when they discover the difference as a result of social media amongst their friends and family, it does reduce their willingness to talk about these political issues in the future, not just online, but at work, when they're out with friends. And that can be, that's a problem probably for democracy. I mean, we like the idea that we can have, important discussions.
But I mean, in your experience with the social networks, I understand that it's quite impolite in Facebook, for instance, to delete a friend. I mean, if he's really nasty, you send it. But if you have a different opinion, that wouldn't be a reason to ban him or her from your network. So how do they deal with differences?
Right. So I mean, we all probably have stories about friends who have said, "Oh, I discovered that my uncle or my cousin has these political opinions that are just really offensive to me."
Right. I mean, he voted such.
And I just unfriended him. But actually, you're right. It doesn't happen very often. Most people don't take that extreme step, partially because it's impolite, and partially because if you get rid of your uncle as your friend, I mean, your aunt is going to be upset, and then your father is going to be upset, and this has ripples, and so you have to learn how to tolerate and deal with difference, or it just doesn't work out as well.
Okay, so before we move on into the issue of political opinions indeed, there is a distinction that is usually made by network analysts between strong ties and weak ties. So in these networks that you are describing, these new type of communities, they grow equally in strong and weak ties, or are these weak ties that take over the composition of the networks? Are strong ties evolving in some sense? So what's the balance between strong and weak ties?
It's really interesting. So the classic community lost argument, right, was one where we were losing strong ties as a result of kind of large-scale technological and social change, right? Now there's an equal argument that could be made that we are investing so heavily in our close social ties as a result of being able to so easily reach our close friends and family, often through mobile devices, that maybe we're doing that at the expense of all these other social relationships around us.
Okay.
And those other social relationships, what we call weaker social ties, we don't often recognize how valuable they are. So we know strong ties are great for things like warm hugs, companionship, emotional support, but weaker crisis. Yeah, I mean, those are the people you go to in an emergency. But weak social ties are really important for other types of resources.
Right, I mean, there is a classic argument by Granovetter about the strength of weak ties, so that social integration, and we are here in a center for social cohesion. I mean, local social cohesion can work on the basis of strong ties, but structural social cohesion hardly will work on weak ties, on strong ties. I mean, it has to rely on weak ties instead.
Absolutely. I mean, when you want to be able to organize, for example, to deal with an external threat, some kind of crime or a problem locally, relying just on strong ties isn't going to get you very far because it's a very small, tight-knit group. But access to weak social ties helps improve access to resources, the size of your collective action, your ability to mobilize. And if you need unique resources or unique information, you shouldn't go to your closest social ties.
That's right.
You go to your weak social ties.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
however, in the networks, I mean, the communities you are just depicting now, do they have this type of weak ties? Because weak ties have been associated with the diffusion of information, with the spread of innovation, with and with structural integration as well. I mean, or is it just that strong ties take over the whole community?
Well, that's the fear. And what we found is that there's truth, we think, to defining that the more you use social media, the more strong ties you do tend to have. But it doesn't come at the expense of weaker social ties. In fact, we find that people who are heavy users of these same technologies don't just report having more close friends, and they're also less likely to be socially isolated, but they also report having more diverse, weaker social ties. And that, has all the benefits that we've talked about before. And when we talk about things like awareness and persistent relationships. Some of this could be because ties that would have gone dormant before. As we move through the life course and changed jobs and changed neighborhoods and left behind friends from primary school and maybe go off to university. If those ties aren't going dormant or disappearing like they used to, but persist over time, some of that weak ties, some of that diversity is coming from that persistence. And we're increasingly aware of what these old social ties are doing, and so we know about resources that are out there amongst that broader network that we would have known about before. And a lot of that has really good advantages for what we call social capital, but there's also some downsides, right? When we become aware of political diversity amongst our network, sometimes it's challenging for us to deal with that, but also we become aware of just a lot of things happening to people we know, and some of these things are very unfortunate, like death of close family members, people losing jobs, and awareness of these negative things happening in the lives of our friends and family, strong and weak ties. Turns out it affects us. It's what we call the cost of caring, right? And we get stressed as a result of these bad things that we're aware of in the lives of our friends and family, and social media and these new technologies amplify that awareness.
And do they help to overcome that type of crisis? Do they provide? Can you get social support from?
Yes,
from
absolutely.
media?
So again, right? This distinction between having an online world of friends and an offline world of friends is just a complete mistake, right? These two are the same social network. They're just using different technologies to interact. And no matter how you become aware of the kind of problems and issues in the lives of your friend or family, whether it's through a text message or social media, you can still see them in person. You can still call them on the phone and provide social support, and even provide it through these technologies. So yes, people who use these technologies report higher levels of companionship, higher levels of emotional support, and overall they tend to feel more supported.
Okay, so there is an effect that has been documented by Barry Wellman and others, that women tend to be more supportive in situations of crisis, and not even crisis. They take a lot of the networking of the family. They remind of the birthdays, remind of the name of people and things like that. Is that happening online as well?
Yeah, that's really interesting. And Barry made this really important observation, right? That women do increasingly paid work. They do the majority of homework, and then they do what we call the network, right?
Right.
And the question of whether women continue this pattern online, it's not totally clear. It's true that women are much more aware of these, for example, these different activities happening in the lives of friends and family. They're more aware of good things and bad things happening in other people's lives, and it does seem to affect them more, right? So women, because they are more aware and receptive of issues of social support around them, they do tend to suffer more as a result of this cost of caring or this increased awareness, or because of all these extra bits that are flowing towards us as a result of social media. Now, that doesn't mean that men can't be supportive, but it is true that women still continue to take on the majority of network, and the extra connectivity offered by these new technologies probably does introduce an additional burden. Yeah.
Okay, so there are some, let's go back to the topic of the political opinions, and how does political information flow through these type of media? What's the dynamics of political communication? I know you've been doing some research on Trump voters. And I wonder if you can elaborate or explain something about your findings in that research.
Yeah, so after the 2016 US presidential election, there was a lot of concern about, these technologies might have played in the election. And a lot of that represented a big switch in terms of how people were talking about the internet and elections. Up until then, certainly starting as early as 2000 in the US presidential election, there's talk about how the internet was allowing for young people to be more politically involved, finding new ways to talk about politics. And suddenly, in 2016, it shifted to social media is allowing for fake news to be disseminated, and maybe it's switching people's minds about who they're going to vote for. And suddenly we were very concerned about all these negative effects. And it's certainly possible that people were exposed to fake news stories that negatively impacted some candidates and favorably impacted other candidates. But what is often not talked about is that people are pretty smart when it comes to the news that they're exposed to. And when you're exposed to news content that most people would see as questionable, you almost always go out and look for other news to see if it is in fact true, right? And you go to television, you go to radio, and you go to other media, and you look for evidence that there's some veracity to this. And the interesting thing about a lot of that fake news was that it was being fairly rapidly talked about and debunked in other media sources. So as well, I kind of questioned the negative role that those particular technologies had on people in that election.
Okay, so in Chile there is a topic on migration. So we've had a surge in migration during the last, let's say, 10 years, but recently there are new waves of migrants coming from different other places than we were used to. So I would say there is a fear or a question about how will the integration of these migrants work in Chile. And as you are describing, the use of these new communication technologies can help to strengthen the migrant groups in opposition to the integration to the Chilean society. That I don't know if you have some experience or can elaborate something on the role of migration and the use of technologies.
Right. So, I mean, this certainly isn't a social event that's limited to Chile, right? I mean, even in the United States, the percentage of the population that are immigrants is the highest it's been since the 1920s. So this effect is being felt, in many different societies, and there are a lot of questions about whether technology encourages integration, or does it allow migrants to maintain the social ties that they previously had with their hosts, their original countries, and now in their host country they spend less time integrating and interacting with those around them.
Okay.
And I mean, I think these are legitimate concerns. What can you do about it? I don't know.
Tell me.
I'm not sure that it's a necessarily problematic, because it does mean that migrants then are getting the social support that they may need to help them integrate into their new communities. And it may not be as problematic as we might initially think. Yeah.
Okay, so I guess we are coming to the end of our conversation. I'd like you to say, what are the future avenues for you in your research? So what are you doing now? What are you planning to do in the future?
Yeah, so there's a couple of lines of work that I'm working on right now. One of them deals with, again, awareness and how awareness might affect our psychological distress. So I'm increasingly interested in mental health issues, and whether this increased awareness we have within our social networks as a result of social media and related technologies is having positive or negative effects on our mental health. And we're just in the process now of analyzing a longitudinal study that follows people over time, and to see whether or not their awareness of their extended family members' mental health as a result of their social media use is increasing or hurting their own mental health. And the preliminary results from that suggest that people who are on social media, who have extended family members, uncles, cousins, even children that don't live at home, if they're also on social media, that the mental health of those people that they are connected to online does affect them over time.
You're saying that it's a contagion. it's contagious.
Yeah, it's exactly it. It's almost like an actual, contagious disease. Yeah. So it turns out that if you are connected to extended family members who are experiencing a decline in their mental health over time, that results in a decline in your own mental well-being over that same time period. But it also works in the other direction. So as things improve for your family members, that the outcome for you also improves. So that's one line of work I'm interested in. And the other one is that I'm interested in how new technologies might impact tolerance towards immigrant groups in particular. So we're interested in looking at how rural communities, as family members move away from those communities, does the persistence of those relationships through social media change people's attitudes and behaviors back in their home communities? So as people move to the city and they come in contact with new migrant groups, for example, that tends to usually result in a change in behavior that is more tolerant to those groups. As you encounter them and see that they're probably not as threatening as you might believe, it tends to improve tolerance, but it doesn't do anything for those people you've left behind in your own community. But now that we have more persistent contact through social media, will that persistence allow for, again, the same kind of contagious behavior to move back to that community, and does tolerance become contagious? Yeah.
That would be great.
Yeah.
So I know it's early to ask, but what's your opinion, or what have you learned about COES during these days? I mean, you've talked to some people, you just arrived here to the conference, but I'd like to have some first impression.
Yeah, I didn't know anything about COES when I came. And so I've been here for 3 or 4 days now, and I've had probably half dozen meetings in that time. And I am so impressed by COES because of its unique cross-disciplinary interaction. So it is one of the few intellectual groups that I've seen that makes cross-disciplinary contact work. Right? So there are sociologists, there are psychologists, there are people from a variety of different disciplinary backgrounds, economists, yeah, and they are united around these common themes that are intellectually stimulating across these disciplines, and their uniqueness in coming together, I think, is generating knowledge that otherwise would never have been created, right? So, and these students that have the opportunity to interact with these faculty members across these different groups, they are going to produce knowledge in ways that would have been impossible isolated in their own disciplines. So I've been very impressed by COES, particularly around that interdisciplinary contact. Yeah,
that's great. It's an effort, and it's difficult to do.
It's incredibly difficult to manage. I mean, my own department at Michigan State University is equally as interdisciplinary, and it's a challenging thing, but it's one of the reasons that attracted me to that organization. Because again, you're interacting with people united by common interests and concerns, but who bring unique information and unique approaches to dealing with these social problems.
That's great. Thank you.
Oh, thank you
for this conversation.
I've really enjoyed it.
I'm sure people will enjoy the conversation as equally as we do.
Great.
Okay, thank you.